Okay, hopefully I can share my slides. All right, that look okay?
Looks great.
In the right place? All right. Okay, so, okay, it's like uncle. We'll talk about anxiety. Uh, it's such a huge problem. You know, anxiety really affects a lot of kids just normally, but with the pandemic, I think we probably at least doubled the incidence. And you know, who isn't a little bit anxious all the time? You know, I think we have this echoing anxiety between, you know, the people we take care of and us and their families and everybody that you walk past. As we transition and put masks on and take masks off and go home and do hybrid and finally go to Wegmans without a mask on and feel like you're walking around naked. And now it feels really bizarre. So it's, you know, anxiety is such a intense topic right now, and it's really difficult to challenge. But I want to present this because really I'm feeling there's really only one way out of this, and that's what I want to talk about today. All right. So isn't it just a normal part of life? Well, everybody knows about anxiety, right? And but then you have about 20% of the normal population that has an anxious temperament, and that's so 1 in 5. That's a lot. A classroom of 30 kids, that's 6 kids. So that's going to be really, really common. And I think that anybody with that is now struggling a little bit, because what happens is you don't like novelty, you don't like change. And that's a normal temperament, but it's also one that's more challenging than typical during a pandemic and during the transition out of it. And I think we've had probably about a 3 times, you know, kind of multiplication of the kids who have really diagnosable anxiety disorders. So we're really flooded with that. I take phone calls from pediatricians every Friday, and I get tons of calls. And in fact, this Friday, my biggest complaint to my wife is like, the pediatricians are so anxious, they're wearing me out. And so it's really, really challenging as they get flooded with all these kids with anxiety symptoms. All right. So how's it looking, people? Well, it presents with a lot of different things. So there are obviously physical signs. That's what the pediatricians are seeing. They're seeing headaches, stomach aches, all that kind of stuff. The frequent flyers at the school nurse. The cognitive stuff that people don't even recognize. They think it's reality, but it's a distortion. They're hypervigilant, they're catastrophic, they ruminate, they worry. And most people almost universally underestimate their ability to cope. So they're faced with a stressor and they're like, I can't do this. I just can't do this. And it's like, yes, you can. You can do this. A lot of separation problems. We've really thrown a wrench into normal separations. And so people have really regressed in that. And some of the comments that people were saying is there are more of these kids than normal because so many have regressed and, you know, become much younger in their emotional development than normal. So it's a challenge. And as we socially expose people to each other, it's hard because we got used to we're a very adaptable species. So we got used to not being around people. So it's very stressful when we suddenly are. All right, what can we do to screen? Well, I use the scared, and whenever you're using a screening tool, you should really think as school districts that we should speak Rochester, whatever the language is of Rochester. So if you're talking about ADHD in the Rochester area, the Vanderbilts are what the pediatricians recognize. If you're talking about anxiety problems, the scared is what primary care doctors recognize. So if you do another screening tool, there are other valid screening tools, but they're not going to understand them as much. And so they're not going to be as fluent. And so the other is the GAD-7, which is okay for older kids. It's only 7 questions, so it does not give you the profile that you get with the scared. And I just have a couple. This is what the scared looks like. It's simple, 41 questions, but they go fast. And it's okay to do them repeatedly. There's no kind of take and retake kind of distortion to it. This is the second page. If you look at the bottom here, there's all this complicated scoring. Don't worry about that. Don't do that. All I do is add up all the numbers, you know, 0, 1, or 2, add them all up, and 25 is the threshold. So if you add all those screening tools up, then of the scared, then if you're over 25, then you're pretty much into very likely having an anxiety disorder. There's a parent report, there's a child report, The parent report you can do for kids as young as 4 or 5 years old. The child self-report, you have to wait until they're like 9, just because they have to be able to read the questions. So that's the scared. I would recommend thinking about that, and don't come up with your own screening tools. It's really a problem. So you want people to recognize it and think that you did something valid and meaningful. And that's really important. So what do you do about this, right? So you figure out, okay, I've interviewed them. The kid seems to have symptoms of an anxiety disorder over several months. They're impaired by it. It runs in the family. The parent and the child, they're just scared. Everybody comes up positive. So now what? Now what? And I think this is really the only message I have today. The only thing you can do is exposure. The only way to help kids with anxiety disorders is expose them to the thing that makes them anxious, support them to get through that, but repetitive exposure is what changes things. So, and that seems so straightforward, right? That doesn't seem so complicated, but oh, it is so complicated. It's complicated because it is not what people want to do. So if you think fancy here, you say, all right, what if we do CBT? Well, CBT is exposure. Basically, CBT is you teach them coping skills, you teach them some cognitive strategies, and you expose them. Well, what if we do a reentry plan to school for a kid who's missing? That is exposure. You know, what do you use SSRIs for? It softens the symptoms so you can do exposure. That's it. That's the end of that. You know, there's no other alternative. So if people say, well, you know, I want to stay home on virtual learning until my anxiety gets better, you say it won't get better. You can't get better without exposure. So that's the end of that story. So you have to raise expectations. And like my bottom one, you have to avoid avoidance. What anxiety makes you want to do is avoid, and you have to always fight against that. You don't want to give them a day off. You don't want to go pick up Junior at school. You don't want to give them a break, because even though you understand it and your heart goes out to the kids, there's no way to get better except through exposure. And that's the kind of the hard truth. Now, what's this look like in school? Well, this is a kind of a couple pictures Amy lines that I came up with. So if you look at all the experiences you can have in a school situation, if you look at the very bottom of this, where the point is, that's home instruction, right? And with home instruction, you get very little of all those things across the top. You get very little exposure to a lot of kids, to managing unstructured time, to managing with a lot of adults, and the complicated academic content. You don't get much of that in home instruction, right? You get a very little nibble. It's not like school. And the farther up this you go, the better, the more you learn, right? The more you, now the problem is someone who's anxious and avoidant, they're not going to see it that way. They're going to see that this is torture. And so, but we have to, in your mind, you have to kind of accept the fact that this is how people get ready to be a young adult. And what are they doing? Well, they're learning these skills. Well, they would be learning these skills if the slide would work. If you look at the ladder skills, I call those ladder skills, in order to be a young adult in this world, you have to have these skills, right? You just have to. And people say, well, you know, what if we accommodate kids and we can get them through school without them ever having to develop any resilience or stamina or strength or adaptability or social skills or autonomy? Well, we haven't done them any great favor. In fact, helping them develop these skills is probably more important than educating them. So that the challenge is then they have the rest of their life to go out there. And I tell parents, listen, school is the last time there's anybody to help you with this. If they somehow squeak their way through school, they graduate or they drop out, and then you're on your own. There's nobody to get that kid out of the cellar. There's nobody to do anything. Nothing happens after school, after high school, unless you make it happen. But while they're still in school, you have help. You have a whole school district who's willing to help you raise your kids and develop these very important ladder skills. And there is no way around it. You really need someone to help you do that. And if that seems so clear and obvious, why doesn't it happen, right? What goes wrong? What goes wrong? Well, you guys have all been through all the what goes wrong, right? The biggest issue is that doing this exposure is not a natural response to a child in distress, right? Parents don't want to distress their anxious kid. Now, which is fine if they're acutely anxious, but it's not fine if they are chronically anxious. That's the difficulty. So that is what I call the pivot. The pivot is when you have to go from like protecting your anxious kid from things that make them anxious to saying, okay, we can't do that anymore. Everything makes my kid anxious. We have to go at it. We have to push against it. We have to nudge the kid, right? We have to do that. Now, anxiety runs in families, so it's hard. You're asking an anxious parent often to tolerate the anxiety of their child when you do this. Now, on our end, we aren't very good listeners. We want solutions that are fast, easy, and simple. It's so obvious to us that you have to stop, indulging this kid when they're not in school and get them to school every day. It's so obvious that it just seems like, just do this. Parents, just do it. But you're missing the whole boat. Why doesn't it happen? It's complicated. It's so complicated to do all the stuff you're tapping into. Now, if the school is going to do anything, you need to develop safe people. The families I've gotten to go back to school or to engage more aggressively in education than they used to do, they've somehow developed a safe person in the school. So I said, listen, if your kid comes home and said, the math teacher swore at me today, before you react, call your safe person and say, hey, this is what my kid said. They said the math teacher swore at them today. Can you check that out? Can you figure out what happened? And, and find out. And, because that moment, that buffer, so to have a liaison person at the school who the parent trusts to get the facts and to give them an accurate description. So no one's going to be defensive. They're not going to minimize. They're going to figure out what happened. So developing those safe people, those empathic people who understand both sides and who are really good at that. If you don't have that, your school's not going to be able to re-engage these families. You have to do it. Now, the empathic person is not hardcore about it. They are not just empathic. They understand the role of empathy. And so when I have kids do things that they don't like, I'm empathic, but I don't change my mind, right? I don't change my mind. So they said, well, starting on Wednesday, you're going to come in the morning and then we'll go around, you're just going to go to first period, but then the following Wednesday, you're going to stay until lunchtime. And they're like, well, I don't want to. I'm like, well, I understand you don't want to. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be really stressful. And you're going to have to use all your skills and all your strength, but I think you can develop mental muscles. I think you can do this. And so I'm nice about it, but I'm relentless. You can't stop. And it's very hard if the kid tantrums, if the kid says, I can't do it. If the kid says, I got a stomach ache or I feel like throwing up. There's so many triggers that people want to not do. So the complicated kind of workings, the dynamics of an anxious system is something, if you're going to try to get these kids back, get them to function, you have to understand how to do that. I've had lots of meetings with families where I'm sitting around the table. I can still picture myself sitting up in Webster around his big table. And, talking to the kid, talking to the family, and I'm saying, so, all this stuff it's really important to go. And it's I'm sitting there and grandma's over there in the corner snorting once in a while, right? And I'm like, what's up, grandma? And she goes, blah, 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 blah. She's all negative about it. And I said, all right, this is going to be super hard for you. So what do you need for yourself? Because this is going to be when they turn and try to get you to save them, to be their grandma, you're going to have to say no. How are you possibly going to say no? How could you ever do that? So I sit there and I talk to that grandma until I win her over. You can't go without her. So I call that the weakest link. You have to find the weakest link and you have to, support them and help. You can't just chastise them and slap their hand. You have to use humor. You have to use you can flirt a little bit. You can be pleasant, whatever it takes, right? To get through.
Jim, I'm giving you a 2-minute warning.
That's okay. That's good. All right. So this is my another kind of diagram. Some of you have already seen this. The idea is you have to circle the wagons, right? You have to get all the wraparound people, the school, the therapist, the pediatrician, and all circling this family with structure and with follow through. And you can't have anybody who's undermining this. So that's the challenge, is how do you build this? One of the things I was hoping to share with you, and I guess Melissa will help me to do that, these are some of my references, is, I was in a committee for a long time. Betsy's here, and she was on the committee too, other people too, of coming up with what do people want to share with each other? What does a pediatrician want to hear from the school? What does the school want to hear from them, or a mental health provider? So we came up with a form. It's not a release of information. You still have to have your releases, but it summarizes that so it's efficient. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a school. There we go. I've gone to a school and I ask, my first question is, who's their pediatrician? And the answer is almost always, I don't know. That's just criminal. That's just criminal. The pediatricians are your teammates. They are doing the same thing you're doing, talking to the same family, and you want to connect with them. So routinely, you should get this information flowing back and forth so you can work together with mental health providers, with medical providers, and with the family. And again, that circle, that wagon, thing, I think is just so important. And it's hard to do, but it's worth every effort that you make. All right, so that's my kind of 2 cents. Philip Kendall designed the Coping Cat program. There's an online version for people who don't have any insurance or something like that, if they happen to have the capacity. Some of the clinics do this, and there's an older version of it. It's basically a manualized CBT program for people with anxiety. It's a beautiful little thing. And there's actually, somebody studied whether school counselors could do it in school and whether it would have the same effect, and it does. So if you're looking for something to do with little anxious ones, or even older anxious ones, this is a pretty good program to consider.
And likewise, we have Coping Cat programs here. I know Roberts is also actively recruiting for Coping Cat participants for kids on the west side of town. At Pediatric Behavioral Health and Wellness, we also have an analogous parent accommodation program called the SPACE program. And it really is about helping parents decrease that accommodation and increase accountability. Roberts also runs a SPACE program for parents that goes along with Coping Cats. They run it at the same time. And so the kids can go learn some skills and the parents can go learn some skills. And they hold them at this literally the same group time. And it can be a really nice way to decrease that accommodation, increase that accountability.
Well, so who's the contact for that program at Roberts?
I can find it and send it out.
Be great, thank you.
Just to comment briefly on Betsy's concerns about doing an assessment, having to go through all that process. It happens, the same thing happens with the